A strange impulse made me turn off my familiar daily path. Little did I know that just steps away from safety, that one small decision was the only line between an innocent life and a tragic, unseen end. My life, since David passed, had become a collection of quiet rituals. I am Eleanor, a 70-year-old woman living in a house that had learned the sound of one person's footsteps instead of two. The mornings were for books and tea, the afternoons for the garden, and the hours just before dusk were for walking. Each day was a careful tracing of the one before it. A predictable rhythm I constructed to keep the silence from becoming a presence of its own. It was a peaceful existence, but it was the peace of a room where the music has stopped. A stillness, heavy, with the memory of sound. Today was no different. After a simple lunch, I stood at the kitchen window, watching the autumn winds of North Carolina coax the last golden leaves from the great oak in my yard. They spiraled down like tiny, defeated suns. It was time for my walk. Pulling on my sturdy boots and David's old wool coat, the one that still smelled faintly of him, of sawdust and pipe tobacco, I stepped out into the crisp air. The path into the Pisgah National Forest began just beyond my garden gate, a familiar invitation into the woods we had explored together for over 40 years. As my feet found their familiar cadence on the packed earth, my mind drifted to him. I saw him up ahead, turning back to smile, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Keep up, Ellie," he would say, even though he was the one who always matched his long strides to my shorter ones. The woods were our sanctuary, but walking them alone felt like reading only my half of a beautiful, shared letter. The air was filled with a rich, damp scent of fallen leaves and pine, a perfume of decay and permanence. I breathed it in, a ritual of remembrance. Normally, I kept to the main trail, the one worn smooth by countless hikers. It was wide and safe, its twists and turns as familiar as the lines on my own hands. But today, something was different. A strange impulse, a quiet and insistent nudge from some deep part of my consciousness urged me to turn. To my left was a smaller, less defined path, little more than a deer trail overgrown with ferns and shadowed by rhododendron. I had never taken it before. David, ever the cautious one, had always called these little offshoots ways to get lost. Yet my feet slowed, and without a conscious decision, I veered from my customary route. The air grew stiller here, the sounds of the main trail fading behind me. The only noise was the soft crunch of my own steps. The path wound deeper into the dense woods, and a prickle of unease ran up my spine. This was foolish. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A flash of something white against the dark bark of a trail marker post up ahead. It was out of place. As I drew closer, the white resolved into a piece of paper, held to the wood by a strip of clear tape. But my attention was immediately pulled downward from the note to the base of the post. There, huddled in a pathetic heap, was a dog. It was a small beagle, a young one, no more than a puppy. His coat was a classic tricolor of black, tan, and a patch of brilliant white on his chest, now soiled with dirt and mud. He was unnaturally still, his body pressed against the wood, as if trying to merge with it, to disappear. A tremor ran through his small frame, a constant, violent shudder that spoke of profound terror. His ears, long and soft, were pinned back against his skull. Then I saw the source of his imprisonment, and a cold dread washed over me. It was not a rope or a leash. It was a thin strand of metal wire, the kind used for picture frames, looped cruelly around his neck and twisted tight to the post. It glinted faintly in the dappled sunlight, a silver line of casual brutality. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My gaze flicked from the wire, cutting into the soft fur of his neck to his eyes. They were huge, a deep, liquid brown, and they were wide with a despair so absolute it felt like a physical blow. He wasn't looking at me. but through me. Lost in a world of fear, I could not begin to imagine. My heart, which had felt so quiet and steady just moments before, began to pound with a fierce, protective anger. Beside the cowering puppy, the note flapped gently in the breeze. Its words were blurred by the dampness of the evening air, a smudged and silent testament to the horror before me. The peaceful, orderly world I had so carefully constructed had just been broken, and in its place was only the trembling body of a terrified animal and the cold, sharp reality of the wire around its neck. The shock lasted only a second before a frantic energy seized me. I dropped to my knees on the cold, damp earth, my old joints protesting with a sharp complaint that I barely registered. My purse fell open, its contents spilling into the leaves. I ignored it. All my focus was on the thin, cruel line of wire around the beagle's neck. My fingers, stiff with age and a touch of arthritis, fumbled as I tried to find purchase on the twisted metal. It was pulled brutally tight, embedded so deeply in his fur that I could barely slip a fingernail underneath. Each time I tugged, a low, guttural whimper escaped the puppy's throat. A sound of such pure misery that it felt like a physical pain in my own chest. I pulled back instantly, my hands shaking. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice a ragged breath. "I'm so sorry, little one. I'm trying to help." But the wire held fast. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise, tightening my throat. My capable, steady hands, the ones that could mend a torn page or gently coax a seedling from the soil, were useless. I was failing him. It was then my eyes caught the flapping piece of paper again. I reached up and carefully peeled it from the bark. The ink was smeared, the handwriting a desperate scrawl. Just a few words were legible. His name Leo. So sorry. Good home. Leo. His name was Leo. Saying it in my mind made him real, not just a symbol of cruelty, but an individual life. And the weight of my failure grew heavier. Realizing I could do nothing more on my own, I scrambled for my purse, my fingers closing around the cold plastic of my phone. I dialed the number for the county animal rescue, a number I had never needed before. When a calm voice answered, I could barely speak. My own voice was thin and reedy, cracking as I tried to describe my location on an unmarked trail, deep in the woods. After I hung up, a profound silence descended once more, broken only by Leo's shuddering breaths. The wait began. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The sun dipped lower, casting long, menacing shadows through the trees. I sat on the ground a few feet from him, not wanting to crowd him, but needing him to know he was no longer alone. "They're coming, Leo," I murmured over and over, as much for my own comfort as for his. "Help is coming." It felt like hours later when I heard the crackle of footsteps approaching. A man in a county uniform appeared, his face etched with a weary professionalism. He was in his 40s, with a sturdy build and a quiet demeanor that suggested he had seen far too many things like this. He gave me a brief, compassionate nod before his attention settled on Leo. He didn't waste time with questions. He simply knelt, pulled a pair of bolt cutters from a pouch on his belt, and with one swift, clean snap, the wire parted. The release of tension was so sudden that Leo just sagged against the post, his legs giving way. He didn't run. He didn't even stand. He just lay there, a small, defeated heap. The officer, whose name I learned was Frank, gently looped a soft slip lead over his head. When he asked if I wanted to ride with them to the shelter, there was no hesitation. "Yes," I said, my voice firm for the first time. "I'm not leaving him." The shelter was a cacophony of barking, a sterile environment of concrete floors and metal doors that smelled sharply of bleach. It was clean and well run, but for a puppy whose entire world had just been terror and silence, it was another form of assault. Leo's body pressed hard against my legs as we walked inside. A young woman named Sarah, with kind eyes and a clipboard, met us at the intake desk. They took Leo to a small quarantine kennel in the back. Through the chain-link door, I watched him immediately retreat to the farthest corner, pressing his body into the wall, a low, fearful growl vibrating in his chest. He was utterly terrified. My heart ached. I turned to Sarah, my hope warring with a rising dread. What happens now? I want to take him home. She gave me a sympathetic but firm look. I understand, but he's a stray, and by law, we have to hold him for 7 days to give an owner a chance to claim him. 7 days! The words felt like a prison sentence. I stared at her, uncomprehending. But he was abandoned, I pleaded, my voice rising. There was a note. No one is coming for him. She just shook her head gently. It's the rule, ma'am. My hands are tied. A wall of procedure, of cold, unfeeling bureaucracy, had just slammed down between me and the little dog who needed me. I had to leave. Turning from the kennel door was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I caught one last glimpse of Leo's eyes, wide and lost, in the dim light of the kennel. I felt his gaze follow me, an unspoken accusation. You're leaving me too. The feeling of abandoning him, of walking away just like whoever had tied him to that post, was a crushing weight. That night, sleep never came. I lay in my bed, staring into the darkness of my silent house, and saw only the image of a small beagle in a concrete box, his eyes asking why. The first day after leaving him at the shelter, I woke with a sense of purpose that shoved aside my exhaustion. My quiet morning rituals were abandoned. I drove to the shelter as soon as their visiting hours began, my heart a nervous drum against my ribs. Sarah, the young woman at the desk, gave me a small, understanding smile. He's in the back, she said softly. He didn't touch his breakfast. My heart sank. I spent an hour sitting on the cold floor outside his kennel, speaking to him in low, soothing tones, telling him about my garden, about David, about anything at all. He never moved from the corner. A small, tricolor statue of misery, his eyes fixed on some distant point of horror only he could see. The second day was the same, and the third, and the fourth. Each visit was a pilgrimage of failure. The cacophony of the shelter, the echoing barks and clanging doors, seemed to amplify my own helplessness. I would leave each afternoon with the scent of disinfectant in my coat and a heavier stone of despair in my soul. I was failing him. The wall of his fear was absolute, and I had no tools to breach it. On the morning of the 5th day, a profound weariness settled over me. I almost didn't go. What was the point? I was likely just another source of stress for him. A persistent, strange woman who sat outside his cage and murmured nonsense. The thought that I was making things worse for him was unbearable. Yet, I found myself putting on my coat, my hands moving out of habit, my feet carrying me to the car. When I arrived, Sarah saw the defeat in my eyes. Let's try the quiet room today, she offered. Her kindness, a small beacon in my fog of gloom. It might be less overwhelming for him. She led me to a small, sterile room away from the main kennels, furnished with only a plastic chair. A few moments later, Frank brought Leo in. The little beagle immediately scrambled to the farthest corner, away from me, and resumed his vigil of terror, his body trembling. I didn't even try to speak to him. My well of gentle words had run dry. I slid down the wall opposite him and sat on the cool linoleum floor, my back against the plaster. I watched him shake, and for the first time, I let the full weight of my hopelessness wash over me. Maybe I couldn't save him. Maybe his trauma was a wound too deep for a stranger to heal. Perhaps the kindest thing would be to walk away and let the professionals handle it. A profound sadness filled me, not just for him, but for the fresh wave of loneliness that his rejection sent crashing over me. In that moment of quiet surrender, With no plan left, something shifted. A memory surfaced, unbidden. David, in our kitchen, humming as he made coffee, his off-key but joyful tune filling the room. It was Moon River, our song. Without thinking, without deciding, I closed my eyes and began to hum. It was a faint, breathy sound, barely audible in the quiet room. At first, nothing happened. Then, the violent trembling in the corner lessened. It did not stop, but the frantic edge was gone. I kept humming, my eyes still closed, pouring all the love and loss I felt for David into that simple, gentle melody. A small, scraping sound. I slowly opened my eyes. Leo had lifted his head. His soft beagle ears, which had been plastered to his skull in fear, had swiveled forward, pointed toward me like small, furry satellites. He was listening. I didn't dare move. I just continued my soft, wordless song. He took one hesitant step forward, then another, his claws making tiny clicking sounds on the floor. He moved with an agonizing slowness, his belly low to the ground, as if expecting a blow at any moment. He crossed the room, this vast, terrifying expanse between us, and stopped just out of my reach. He stared at me, his deep brown eyes no longer vacant with terror, but filled with a cautious, heartbreaking curiosity. I held my breath. He leaned his head forward, sniffing the air, then my outstretched, unmoving hand. And then, he did it. He rested his muzzle gently on my knee, a feather-light pressure, and let out a soft, low whimper. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of release, a sigh of sorrow that had been held in for far too long. A single hot tear escaped my eye and rolled down my cheek. The wall of ice had not just cracked, it had begun to melt. That moment in the quiet room, with Leo's head resting on my knee, changed everything. The remaining 2 days of his legal hold were transformed. When I visited, he would lift his head from his small bed, and a faint, hopeful light would enter his eyes. He still wouldn't cross the room until I sat on the floor and began to hum, but the journey was faster each time, his fear slowly giving way to a fragile trust. Finally, the 7th day arrived. I drove to the shelter with a lightness in my heart I hadn't felt in years, my purse containing a new collar and leash. I walked in, my smile ready, only to be met by Sarah's apologetic face. "Eleanor, I am so sorry," she began, and my stomach plummeted. There was a clerical error on his intake form. The county supervisor has to sign off on the correction before we can legally release him, and she won't be in until tomorrow morning. My joy evaporated, replaced by a sharp sting of disappointment. I saw Leo in the visitation room, waiting for me, and the thought of leaving him for one more night was agonizing. But looking at him, and then back at Sarah's genuinely regretful expression, I saw not a wall, but a hurdle, a final, small test of patience. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be here first thing in the morning." The next day, the paperwork was waiting. I signed my name on the adoption forms, my hand surprisingly firm. When Sarah handed me the leash, the simple transfer of that nylon strap felt like a sacred rite. Leo stepped out from behind her desk and walked right to my side, as if this was where he had always been meant to be. The ride home was quiet, a peaceful contrast to the tense journey to the shelter a week earlier. He sat on the passenger seat, not cowering, but looking out the window for a time before turning his gaze on me, his soft brown eyes simply watching. When we arrived, I opened the front door and stood back. "You're home, Leo," I whispered. He stepped inside cautiously, his nose twitching, taking in the scent of old books, dried lavender, and a life lived quietly. He explored every room, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the hardwood floors, a new and welcome percussion in the silent house. His journey of rebirth began with a series of quiet firsts, each one a precious milestone. The first was his dinner. I filled a small bowl with the puppy food the vet had recommended and set it on the kitchen floor. He circled it, sniffed it, and then looked up at me as if for permission. I just nodded. He took a tentative bite, then another, and then he ate with a steady, quiet focus until the bowl was spotlessly clean. The simple sound of him eating in my kitchen filled a space I didn't know was empty. That night, I placed a soft bed for him on the floor next to mine. I expected a night of restlessness, of anxious whining. Instead, he circled the bed 3 times, curled into a tight ball, let out a long, deep sigh of profound release, and fell asleep. I woke several times just to look over and see his small body rising and falling in the moonlight. A picture of perfect peace. He was sleeping soundly for the first time. A few days later came the first wag of his tail. I was sitting in my armchair reading, and I spoke his name softly. Leo. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Just the very tip of his tail gave a small, hesitant flick. It wasn't a full, happy wag, but it was a start, a tiny flag of burgeoning happiness. I felt my own heart give a corresponding flutter. The first real sound of his joy came the following week. I found an old tennis ball in the back of a closet and rolled it gently across the living room floor. He watched it go, his head cocked. Then he let out a short, sharp yap. It was high-pitched and full of surprise. The first sound he had ever made that was not born of fear or pain. In the weeks that followed, the true Leo began to emerge from the shell of his trauma. The trembling, terrified creature was gone. In his place was a beagle puppy full of gentle curiosity and a surprising streak of mischief. He was fascinated by the rustling autumn leaves in the yard, pouncing on them with clumsy grace. He discovered the joy of sleeping in a patch of afternoon sun on the rug, and he became my shadow, following me from room to room, resting his head on my lap whenever I sat down, his warm, solid presence, a constant comfort. He was no longer just surviving, he was learning to live. The seasons turned. The fiery brilliance of autumn gave way to the quiet slumber of a North Carolina winter, and then melted into the tender green of spring. Months passed, and the fragile trust forged in a sterile shelter room blossomed into a deep and unwavering companionship. Leo was no longer the ghost who haunted my house with his fear, but its joyful, beating heart. The rhythm of my life, once so solitary, now included the happy click of his nails on the floor, the soft thump of his tail against the armchair as I read, and the contented sighs he'd let out as he slept at my feet. The silence in my home was no longer an emptiness, but a shared peace. He had healed, and in watching him, I realized that I had too. I was no longer just a widow living in the past, but Eleanor, Leo's person, firmly rooted in the present. On a rainy April afternoon, with Leo dozing on the rug, I finally decided to tackle the last bastion of my grief. A large, dust-covered box in the back of David's closet, filled with the things he'd treasured. I hadn't had the strength to open it before, but with Leo's warm presence nearby, the task felt manageable. I sat on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, a collection of woodworking magazines, his favorite worn flannel shirt. Near the bottom was a copy of a book of poetry he loved to read aloud. As I lifted it, a small folded piece of notepaper fluttered out and landed on the floor. I picked it up. It was his handwriting, the familiar, strong script I knew as well as my own. The note was short, clearly written years ago, and tucked away as a hopeful thought. It read, "My dearest Eleanor, someday, let's get a beagle." I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the note in my hand and the soft sound of Leo's breathing. All these years I had forgotten. In the fog of our busy lives, and then the haze of my grief, this shared, simple dream had been lost. A wave of emotion so powerful It made me dizzy, washed over me. It was not a coincidence. It was a gift. It felt as if David had reached across the years, across the silence, and sent this little dog to me. Leo hadn't just filled an empty house. He had unknowingly fulfilled a final, unspoken promise, weaving the past and present together into a beautiful, unbroken thread of love. I looked at the sleeping beagle, his tricolor coat shining in the lamplight, and I understood. I hadn't just saved him from a lonely fate. He had been sent to save me from mine. A few days later, on a bright, sunny morning, I knew what we had to do. I found a smooth, gray stone from my garden, and, with a small brush, carefully painted a single black paw print on its surface. Then, with the stone in my pocket and the original, sad note from the trail marker, I clipped on Leo's leash. We walked back to the park, back to the trail I had once stumbled upon in sorrow. The woods were alive with the sounds of spring, and the path was no longer menacing. It was just a path. Leo trotted ahead happily, his tail wagging, sniffing at every new and wonderful scent. We reached the marker post. I knelt down on the soft earth, the same spot where I had knelt in a panic all those months ago. I dug a small hole with my hands and placed the crumpled, tear-stained note inside, burying the memory of abandonment forever. In its place, I set my painted stone, a simple, permanent declaration. This place of sorrow was now a place of love, a new beginning. As I stood, I watched Leo pouncing after a yellow butterfly, his movements full of pure, unburdened joy. I thought about how strangely life works, how a story that began with such cruelty could end in such peace. I had found him tied to a tree with nothing but a desperate plea for kindness, and in offering it, my own life had been filled to the brim with a love I thought I would never feel again. He taught me that a broken heart can learn to heal, that a silent house can learn to sing again, and that sometimes the creatures we set out to rescue end up rescuing us right back. There are so many other dogs like Leo, waiting in shelters, their own stories paused on a chapter of fear and loneliness. They are waiting for someone to turn the page for them. If this story has touched your heart, I ask you to be their hope. Share their stories. Support your local rescues. And consider opening your home. Be the person who finds them in the woods. Be the one who says, "You matter." You may find, as I did, that the home you save is your own.